everybody. I'm Emilie Aries. I'm the founder and CEO of Bossed Up, and I am here joined with the marvelous co-host of Stuff Mom Never Told You, Bridget Todd, the one and only, as well as Paula Szuchman, the head of on-demand content at WNYC Studios, tuning in from New York.
Hello.
We are so excited to be talking about how podcasting today can accelerate your career. And we're going to talk a little bit about our experience in the industry, as well as where we see this trend heading and why, personally, we all want to see more women in studio. We all want to see more women's voices in the podcast space. And we're going to talk about how we can make that happen. I see that we've got a bunch of people who are already tuned in, so welcome to today's conversation. Make sure to send us a little chat in the chat bar like Rachel just did, telling us where you're tuning in from St. Paul, Minnesota. That's awesome. We are also on Twitter at WNYC Studios for WNYC Studios, and the other two handles you can see on your screen there, Mom Stuff Podcast for Bridget and I, and Bossed.org for Bossed Up, my company that helps women navigate career transition. So many great people are tuning in. I'm loving the representation. So let's dive right into today by first sharing a little bit about who's on the call today. Paula, do you want to take a second to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Paula. I'm the Vice President for On-Demand Content at WNYC Studios here in New York. We are one of the largest producer of podcasts in the country. And my job is to find new shows, develop them, find new talent, nurture the shows that we do create. In my past life, I was a reporter and an editor at the Wall Street Journal and at the Daily Beast. And I wrote a book called, which Emilie, was just talking about buying. So I'm going to hold her to that. Called Economics, about how economics can help improve your relationships. And now I'm in the podcasting business. I'm also the organizer of a conference coming up in October, kind of a one-of-a-kind conference called Work It, which is a women's podcasting festival, all created by women, for women from around the world. 3 days of workshops and networking and sessions, and 3 nights of live podcast tapings. I'm the producer of podcasts that you might have heard of. Hopefully you've heard of, called Two Dope Queens with Jessica Williams and Phoebe Robinson. So Many White Guys with Phoebe, Note to Self with Manusha Marodi, a new show called Nancy that we just launched, which is an LGBTQ show, and many, many more things in development. So that's me for now.
Thanks, Paula. I'm so glad you could join us. Bridget, take it away.
Hey y'all, I'm Bridget Todd. I'm here in beautiful Washington, D.C. If you listen to the podcast that Emilie and I co-host on the How Stuff Works Network, you might already know me. I am the co-host of Sminty, which if you don't know what that is, it's Stuff Mom Never Told You, which is a twice-weekly podcast really unpacking the business of being a woman, from politics to pop culture, with an intersectional feminist lens. In addition to that, I'm also a writer. I'm a former teacher at Howard University, also based here in DC. And I also work with political organizations and advocacy organizations, helping them sort of use the power of the internet to really push sort of social change. I've worked with organizations like the Women's March. Currently, I'm working with Planned Parenthood, and I'm just really all about like creating social change using the power of the web and making the world a better place for all us ladies out there.
I love it. I love it. Thanks so much for being here with me, Bridget, virtually for a change instead of in person. I have had the pleasure of a lifetime to step up as co-host of Stuff Mom Never Told You with Bridget on the fabulous How Stuff Works network, which I'm proud to say has a plethora of amazing women behind the mic, like our co-hosts on Stuff You Missed in History Class, another amazing one of the How Stuff Works podcasts. But I'm also kind of wearing a second hat today. Some of you might know me from Bossed Up, my company that I started 5 years ago now, to help women break the cycle of burnout and really invest in happy, healthy, and sustainable career paths. I started off my career in politics, and I had the great pleasure of serving on behalf of then newly elected President Barack Obama. But after 3 years of nonstop overwork and not taking care of myself, and frankly finding myself in some seriously toxic relationships, I burnt out before the age of 25. And I had to learn the hard way that, working myself to the bone, which I think is something that women in particular do, because in academic life, we get really good grades, and that doesn't always transfer over to life after the end of a semester, when you're not going to get a report card anymore. So I found out that investing in my personal sustainability was actually an investment in my career and my ability to have the impact that I really want to have in being part of the changes that I want to see happen in my lifetime. So I have gone on to create training programs that we host along with our incredible team of trainers across the country at Bossed Up, especially through our one-of-a-kind weekend program called Bossed Up Boot Camp, which is especially for women who are navigating career transition. So today, I am so fortunate to have brought together and had your involvement, Bridget and Paula, in bringing those two worlds of Stuff Mom Never Told You and Bossed Up together for a second, because I really believe that in today's day and age, there's lots of different ways to navigate career transition. And one of them, frankly, is this new medium called podcasting, which isn't all that new, but it might be new to a lot of folks on the line. So we're going to break it down, keep it pretty high level today, but know that there are lots of ways that you can go deeper with all of us into this conversation if podcasting is something you want to dive into, which we all really encourage you to do. So thank you, Paula and Bridget, for joining me today. What we're talking about today is really this, like how and why podcasting can actually be part of your career pivot strategy, especially for those who are in a day job that might pay the bills, but isn't exactly aligned with what you're passionate about, or doesn't allow you to have the kind of creative outlet that you might be craving. Podcasting is a good consideration for how to bring more of that into your life. We're going to break down some career transitions of some of our favorite friends in the podcasting space, and talk through a little bit more about the business landscape and barriers to entry that you have to consider when diving into this industry. We're going to leave you with more resources. Do not worry, that the topmost of which is the Work It Festival in Los Angeles that WNYC is bringing together this year, that Bridget and I are also going to be speaking at. So stay tuned for more details on that. And please continue to use that chat function to ask questions throughout today's broadcast. We'll come back to those at the end of our conversation, which should take about 45 minutes. So we'll have lots of time for Q&A, and we will be sending a recording of this to everybody who registered. So if you or someone you know couldn't make it or has to drop off today, feel free to know that if you register, you'll get a recording. So let's go in a little bit further on who this is for, just so you know if you're in the right place. If you're craving a little bit more creativity in your career path, this could be a really effective way to do that. If you're considering stepping behind the mic, or maybe you already have and have started your own podcast, this is a great way to continue that conversation with us. And if you're just looking for a way to pivot into a career path that better aligns with your area of expertise and passion, this is one of those conversations, and podcasting is one of the ways that we can do that. So to just sort of dive right in, Bridget and I want to talk first about the power of a personal brand, which frankly, as someone who thinks and talks a lot about women in career trajectories and women in career transition, I don't think you can underestimate the power of what other people are saying about you, even when you're not around. And to me, that's really what your personal brand is all about. Bridget, do you want to share a little bit about what this has been like for you and navigating that?
Sure. I think I love the question, what are people saying about you when you're not around? I've really spent a lot of time thinking about that. I think when I first got involved in media and politics and things like that, I really did so out of this deep desire to express myself. I wanted people to say about me, Bridget is someone who has something to say, and that when Bridget speaks, people listen. And so in the beginning of my career, I did not feel that way at all. I often felt, frustrated about things I saw on the news, things I saw happening in politics, things I saw happening in the media. And my way of releasing that frustration was to just go and bang out like a really angry Facebook status or an angry tweet and sort of think, that'll show them, and then hit tweet. But really that was kind of just driving my frustration more, because it was like shouting into the wind. I was never sure if anyone was hearing me, if I was making a difference, if this mattered at all. And so really podcasting has been so, so important to me as a means of helping me find my voice and allow for folks to say those things about me that I wanted them to say, which is that Bridget is someone who has something to say, and when she says those things, people listen. I tried to sort of scratch that itch a little bit first through freelance writing, which was great. But when you're working a full-time job, you don't always have the capacity to write a pitch, send a pitch email, follow up on that pitch, spend hours writing, get edits back, all of that. I wanted it to be more of a reliable platform that if I had something to say, I could just put it out there. And that's really what podcasting has given me. And it's really allowed me to really find my voice and sort of speak up and say those things that I had inside. It's also given me a lot professionally, just in that I've had so many more professional opportunities now that I've started podcasting. I've really been able to position myself as more of a thought leader on issues around politics and feminism and issues that pertain to women.
I love it. Thank you so much. I also feel like you highlighted so many great ways to establish more of your personal brand too, even before podcasting. Writing is certainly not the easiest way to do it, but it's an important way that you've done it. Bridget's been published in the Atlantic magazine and lots of other great places. And your shouting into the wind was a pretty effective use of social media, I would say.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah, I feel like your use of Twitter has been instrumental in building up your credibility and your voice, right? So I think all of this, podcasting fits into the broader umbrella of establishing yourself as someone who's got something to say, like Bridget said. And what I think of it as, when people come to me because they're looking for their next job, there's two ways to do it. One, you have devoted yourself entirely to the job you've been in, like I did when I was on the Obama campaign. So much so that you haven't sent a personal tweet out in 3 years, or you haven't really done any other writing outside of your day job, or you haven't really done any kind of personal brand voice development because you've been fixated on and totally immersed in your day job. And then you come, 3 years later, I got laid off because the campaign was over, and that's a great, victory, but it's also a career pivot that was forced upon me. And I remember thinking, wow, I haven't actually devoted any time to my personal brand because I was immersed in martyring myself for this broader cause, this broader brand that I was a part of. That's so easy to do. And I see so many women doing that. But being engaged in developing your own voice, whether it's social media, podcasting, writing, whatever, is a proactive way to help opportunities find you, instead of a reactive way of saying, oh my gosh, I'm laid off, I need to find a job. Who's going to think of me as the woman who cares about women's issues and who has something to say about it? It's kind of one of those maintenance things that we have to keep in mind. And one of the best ways to start is just think through these two questions. What do you want to be known for? And yes, that's a valid thing to want. Don't feel like we have to be coy women who aren't known for our boss skills. We can give ourselves permission to want to be recognized for our passions, our work ethic, etc. And then who do you really want to know you for that? So if you're thinking down the line, your ideal career would be in the media landscape that's focused on technology and diversity. Who are the people, who are the conversation leaders, the thought leaders in tech and diversity that you want to know of you, who you want to know about you, and how are you putting yourself in front of that audience? So the good news is those tools, writing, social media, they're more small d democratic than ever before. They're accessible. So it's really about, in my opinion, remembering that your personal brand is worth your time, just like your employer is worth your time and energy and effort. So making sure that you're starting now to think strategically about how you're going to develop your personal brand can make your next career pivot so much easier. A few examples of women we love who have navigated career transitions with the help of podcasting to accelerate their brand and their personal voice are as follows. Bridget, do you want to start with the amazing WNYC's one of the two dope queens?
Yes, I could talk about my love of Jessica Williams all day, and I basically kind of do. So Jessica Williams really got her start as a correspondent on The Daily Show, where everyone loved her. She was super, super great and just so hilarious. She kind of used that to really build up her credibility in the media industry and all of that. After she left The Daily Show, there was this big campaign on social media of folks who thought like, oh, she should take it over. She should be the new host. And she really just started focusing more on her podcast with Phoebe Robinson, Two Dope Queens. The podcast was super, super successful. Right after they launched it, it went to #1 on iTunes, like right away. People loved it. And she's really been able to use the podcast to navigate this career pivot from Daily Show to doing other projects. In addition to her wildly successful podcast, she just had a Netflix movie, a full feature-length film called The Incredible Jessica Jones, which she was the executive producer on. She's got other scripted shows in the works, and really podcasting seems to have been the thing that really enabled her to navigate that career pivot from Daily Show, being a correspondent, to all of these other great successful projects.
Awesome. And Paula is a lot of that process too, to thank for your work behind WNYC's Two Dope Queens. Did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, no, I was going to add that, when Jessica talks about her sort of transition into Two Dope Queens, she had met Phoebe on the set of The Daily Show, and Phoebe Phoebe was doing the show on her own called Blaria, and Jessica was saying she wanted to get more. Jessica had gone to UCB, wanted to like get more into stand up again and sort of try like flex that creative muscle. And we had been working with Jessica on a couple of live events that we were doing. And so Phoebe was like, why don't you be my co-host? They renamed it Two Dope Queens. They started working with us on producing the podcast. And, you've really seen Jessica in a way that you didn't see her on The Daily Show. And she's, the two of them, as you know, have kind of taken off. But I think Bridget really hit on something with the idea of, you wouldn't necessarily think that someone who's, a big deal on TV would then use a podcast to transition into a new, she did stand up before, but it's like a more 360 degree sort of creative career that she's been going into. And now she's working on stuff for Comedy Central, and she's got her film. So, and it's been great to see. And I think it's a great example.
Awesome. And just in case folks haven't heard of these podcasters, all of their handles for Twitter are on here, and the names of the podcasts that we're shouting out to are in bold here.
Jessica, go on. Sorry, I'll talk about it. Okay. No, I'll talk about it later. That's okay.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we're super psyched to see Jessica at Work It, the festival in Los Angeles. They're going to be, Phoebe and Jessica are doing a live recording one of those evenings, so we're psyched to hang out with them some more. Alex Laughlin is a friend of mine that I first met in DC, who has a very different path, right? It's one thing to go from TV to a network like WNYC's podcast. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about the independent route, because not everybody gets that call from WNYC or How Stuff Works, like we were fortunate to do. But that doesn't mean that you can't get into this business. So Alex Laughlin is a great example, because she started her own independent podcast called The Lady Cast, interviewing different women leaders and entrepreneurs. I had the great pleasure of meeting her then. She had sort of talked to me when I'd first started launching Bossed Up, and we've kept in touch ever since. At the time, Alex was working on social media with the Washington Post. So for all intents and purposes, she was sort of pigeonholed to social media in the journalistic landscape. So by doing The Lady Cast, she, as an independent podcaster, was able to prove her skills, develop her skills, and prove herself as a competent on-air talent and a producer and a podcaster, like all of the things. Being an independent podcaster means you get to do all of the things, right? And she did a great job with that, which I think is part of the reason why the Washington Post gave her the opportunity to do an incredible mini-series called Other: Mixed Race in America, which is so well produced, so incredibly put together. And you've got to check it out if you haven't heard of this already. Alex was the podcaster behind it, the main person putting all the content together, and she did such a great job. She shortly thereafter took a job at BuzzFeed working to launch their new podcast, Reporting to You. And I also believe that she's working on some other behind the scenes podcasting with BuzzFeed there as well. So it's a great example of how Alex Laughlin, as a young person in the journalistic social media landscape, used her own independent podcast to make podcasting her full-time job. So that just shows you how, this is an industry that rewards innovation and ingenuity, and taking that initiative as an independent podcaster can also get your foot in the door. One other person who is an independent podcaster I want to give a shout out to is Kathleen Hart. Kathleen is one of our featured Boss Up Bootcamp trainers here. She's a friend of mine who lives in the Bay Area, and she is an entrepreneur. And tell me if we have any entrepreneurs or aspiring entrepreneurs on today's webinar in the chat, because if you are an entrepreneur, you know that a big part of your job is marketing, right? Not only are you developing your services or your products, your offerings, but also getting marketing out there, telling people more about your work. And one of my favorite ways to do marketing is just like this, is content marketing, giving people something of value for free as a way to raise awareness of the other stuff that you do. And Kathleen has done that really brilliantly with her podcast, The Big Leap Show, which is all about female entrepreneurs. She does a great job. She produces it completely independently, and it has helped her not only grow awareness of her own business and her own consulting, but it's also helped her uncover what are the needs in her audience. So she recently rebranded herself and sort of pared down her offerings and services to focus exclusively on women and negotiation. So through this creative effort that was The Big Leap Show, she was able to pinpoint a pain point that she wanted to focus her business on. So it can not only grow with your business and market your business, it can give you even more insight into what needs are out there that your business can fill. So excited to see so many questions coming in. I'm going to hand it over to Bridget too to talk through our good friend Amber J. Phillips's podcast story too.
Yes, Amber J. Phillips is a friend of our show. If you listen to the episode of Stuff Mom Never Told You around the war on women's health, she was our special guest, and we love her so much. What I love so much about Amber's story is that it mirrors the story that Emilie was just talking about around The Big Leap, where she really has been able to use independent podcasting to really enhance kind of what she does. So Amber is an amazing reproductive justice activist. She's worked for organizations like Planned Parenthood and currently works for a youth reproductive justice organization called Advocates for Youth. But in establishing her independent podcast that she films or she records with her friend just in their apartments in their spare time, all around Black youth and pop culture and feminism, she's really been able to merge her day job doing this awesome organizing around reproductive rights with podcasting. And so through her really great podcast, The Black Joy Mixtape, she's been able to take those skills that she used presenting herself as a podcaster back to her day job. And so now with Advocates for Youth, she hosts their live streams. She's often used as their on-air talent when other organizations are looking for on-air talent to talk about women's rights and reproductive justice. They think of her. She's been able to work with brands like Refinery 29 just by this kind of creative project that she did in her spare time with her friend in her apartment. And so you can really use this to sort of have podcasting be your full-time thing, or just have it be a really nice encapsulation of all the things that you do, including your day job if you want.
Awesome. Well said. So let's talk, we could talk all day about the great examples out there, not only here in the US, but abroad, like one of our viewers asked about. We wanted to really highlight our friends who've pivoted and developed their businesses or developed their careers further through podcasting. So let's talk for a second. And Paula, I would love to hear your thoughts on this, about kind of the lay of the land in the podcasting space.
Well, it is a very busy space. And it just became, it started becoming very, very busy just a couple of years ago. I got to WNYC 4 years ago, and we started WNYC Studios about 2 years ago, which is when I started developing podcasts. And it is, it's just the competition is crazy, and the top iTunes charts are always reshuffling with new stuff. So I think the podcast audience at the moment, according to Edison, is about 67 million people in the country. And that's up 17% over last year. So, it's still, it's growing. I mean, 17% is a big leap, even though 67 million is probably less than the number of people who watch TV shows. And that's one of the challenges that we have as podcasters, is capturing the attention of people who have a lot of different media to choose from. So 61% of people 12 years and older reported listening to online radio, which is also up 9% over the year before. So one thing that, Emilie, you pointed out that hasn't really changed is that, I mean, it's changed somewhat, is women in the space. So in 2013, there was sort of a now seminal article about women in the industry by Julie Shapiro, that only 20% of the shows in the top 100 podcasts in iTunes were hosted by women. Now we do our own research on this. We check the charts every month, and you can see this nice infographic here. So that number is up to 33% at last count from 20%, and that's in 4 years. And that's our own analysis using iTunes data. So again, some change, but still not even close to parity. I think generally speaking, the medium when it started, which was more than a decade ago in people's basements, has long been sort of a white male dominated space. And that's one of the things that I've been pushing up against, and so has WNYC. So you can see 22%, according to our count, is hosted by women, 11% co-hosted, and 67% male hosted. And but I think more women are finding, and we see it here as well, that it's a really incredibly powerful medium, especially for women, to and not just express themselves, but to take their artistry into the medium. It's a very intimate medium. It's a very imaginative medium. We talk about how TV kind of can dull the mind, which is fine. We all need that. But audio can pique our interest and make us think. And there's a lot of research that shows that it's a space where you really have to focus. You really hear someone close in your ear, and you really have to make the images in your mind, so much like you do when you're reading a book. So it's a very intimate and powerful medium, and a lot of women, we have a show called Note to Self, hosted by this woman, Manoush Zomorodi, who is a longtime TV reporter. And, she's like on the mic on the BBC, like really stiff and following all the rules and being very objective. And then suddenly she not suddenly, but she moved into the audio space and, basically started transforming back into herself and, putting herself into the conversation, still being like a kick-ass reporter and fleshing out really good stories, but realizing that the audience was much like wanted to hear her and what was her connection to all these stories. So she talks about podcasting as a feminist medium, which I think is a really interesting note. So that's a general lay of the podcast land with specific focus on women, although it, the power of it applies to everybody.
I love it. Bridget, did you want to dive in?
Oh, I just was snapping in agreement with pretty much everything Paula just said. I worked in news for a little while, and when you work in news, you have to force yourself to not be yourself in a kind of way. And so you really internalize, people don't want to hear my take. People don't want to hear my opinion. People don't want to hear my voice. And the transition from working in a news environment to the podcast space, it really is like reclaiming your voice as a woman, reclaiming wrestling with things on air and having that be okay, having, forming your opinion about something and giving that opinion and digesting it verbally, if that makes sense, on air. So I just really identify with all the things that Paula just said, and I just wanted to lift them up because they sound so similar to my own experience as a podcaster.
Yeah,
so true. And I also want to highlight what a vulnerable experience that can be, because it is intimate. You do feel like you're friends with the people that you're listening to on your podcast app. So there is this vulnerability that we bring to our show, at least Stuff Mom Never Told You, that is uncomfortable sometimes, because when you're forming an opinion, when you're wrestling with ideas, when you're daring to put that out there as your voice, you're also welcoming criticism, feedback, disagreement, all things that I love and I think are good for us as a society. But it can be really scary in a way that reporting on the news doesn't feel like it's a personal attack on you. So it's just something I wanted to underscore. Paula, we had a quick question here too, that I thought we might answer. We had someone asking, she's getting her master's in radio in the UK. She's passionate about storytelling. Would you say that this genre or this business of podcasting is still going strong and is on the upswing?
Yes, for sure. It shows no sign of waning, and you can see that even if you look at media coverage of podcasting, there are now like podcast reviewers, just like there are film and TV reviewers. There are many more conferences around the globe. We're being hit up by film and TV studios that want to get into podcasting. I mean, it's insane. It's like you would, and I think, the stakes are lower. The barriers to entry are lower. It's, you don't need big fancy cameras. The technology is open source. So the barriers to entry are lower. And again, it's a more, and for advertisers too, it's a much closer touch point to the audience. So I don't see it waning. I mean, definitely it's shot like really high, really fast. And so it might start to stabilize at some point. But, if you consider the relatively small percentage of the population that listens to podcasts, there's so much more room to grow. So I wouldn't be dissuaded at all. And I also noticed that person asked a question about the millennial podcast. And I just wanted to point out that Megan Tan is another person who started as an independent, recording her podcast literally in her closet in Maine, and now is part of the Radiotopia network, which is kind of a big deal, and completely organically. And also that is a storytelling show. So I also don't think storytelling, storytelling is like as old as humanity. So I don't see that going anywhere.
So let's talk a little bit about the kind of Megan Tam experience, or those barriers to entry that you started to talk about. We're getting a ton of questions about, okay, what about a beginner like me? I don't know how to get started. How do I do that? So thank you for your patience, because y'all have been asking. Let's dive right into barriers to entry. And to us, really, these are the 4 things to consider. First and foremost, figuring out your miking situation is something that's a little more detailed than we have time to tackle in today's podcast, but that's one of the first things you got to do. Thinking about where you're going to record. If you're going to rent studio time, you can totally find studios around. Do a quick Google search in your neighborhood, in your city, in your state. See if you can rent some studio time. If that's not an option, or you don't want to shell out cash for studio time, you can definitely start under your covers or in your closet or padding your room. So there's a lot on YouTube that I found super helpful when it came time to just get the bare bones beginning started, that pretty much all independent podcasters go through like that. Paula, you were saying that it's like a low barrier to entry when it comes to the way that the technology of iTunes and RSS feeds work. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I don't want to muck it up because I'm not like a tech expert, but the technology is super basic. It's an RSS feed, and so you don't have to pay to get your podcast on iTunes. And iTunes is just like, there's a lot of different platforms. iTunes is the biggest in the US, but there's also Google Play, and there's TuneIn and Stitcher, and SoundCloud. You can find them anywhere. And a simple Google search will tell you how to load it up. But if you if you record something and you put it out into the RSS feeds, like it goes everywhere. I mean, I don't know how many podcasts are on iTunes right now, but I think it's in the 5 digits. I mean,
Wow.
don't quote me, but yeah, very simple.
Amazing.
And that's actually, you know, part of the problem is that because it's a good and a bad thing. So just like blogging was, you know, 10, 20 years ago, like anyone can blog, which is a great equalizer. It also means that like you can get kind of overwhelmed by all the things that are out there. And when it comes to RSS feeds, it can be a little bit hard to keep track of your audience and to know your audience because iTunes is kind of a gatekeeper. But yeah, it's pretty straightforward.
Awesome. One thing that, who was it here? I want to say Rachel Hansen just mentioned in the comments is that a lot of libraries are also opening up studio space for podcasting and making equipment available for that as well. So check out your local library. I think that's such a great point. Bridget, did you want to speak to anything on here too?
I think you guys really nailed it. I think I just love the idea of sort of like thinking creatively about your community. I know here in DC, a local high school has a podcast studio that they're kind of opening up to the public. So really, I would encourage you to do some research and really think creatively and openly about how you can use resources that you might not even know are there to kick off your podcast career.
In Boston, PRX opened the Podcast Garage, I think it was like a year ago, which is also a space that you can go in and record.
So cool. So the other consideration that I think is sometimes overlooked, but a huge part of podcasting is what happens before you walk into the booth. And if you're an independent, you're not going to have a production team to really walk through the construct of your story or exactly what you're going to say and how you're going to say it. And as organic and conversational as I know Bridget and I probably sound in our podcast, there's a lot of planning and a lot of research and a lot of forethought that goes into every single episode that we produce together. So think about how to develop your craft as a storyteller. Think about what the format of your show is going to be. There's so many different ways that people are using the medium of podcasting. There are some shows that are pure news bulletins now, like that BuzzFeed podcast we mentioned earlier that Alex Laughlin's working on. There are podcasts like Lauren's AMU's podcast on it's a podcast on podcast, but I'm totally blanking on the name right now. Does anyone know what I'm talking about?
The Big Listen.
The Big Listen that actually features different podcasters. She has a different array. It's almost like a newsletter audio style. So there's lots of little stories told within it.
There's also one that the CBC does out of Canada called Podcast Playlist.
Cool. I mean, there's so many ways to format your podcast. We like to keep it super simple at How Stuff Works and on Stuff Mom Never Told You's podcast. But thinking about the narrative arc, what's going to be the beginning? What's going to be the middle? What's going to be the end? And there's lots more resources on storytelling for you to develop your craft, whether it's reading a little bit more from your English lit classes or, seeking out kind of coaching and support on that as well.
This is a little bit in the weeds, but I will say also that when you talk about beginning, middle, and end, is that look at how long the podcasts that you listen to and the popular podcasts are, because there are certainly popular podcasts that are longer than an hour, but most people can't make something good that lasts longer than an hour. And, I think it's important to think about keeping the time to commuting time. What if I'm only going to listen between my home and work, I have 15 minutes, I'm going to pick one thing. If I look at something that's like 75 minutes, I'm going to be like, that just sounds hard.
Yeah.
So I think those really long podcasts are a little bit more for like, they sometimes have rabid audience. There's a comedy podcast that are super long. There's like sports podcasts that are super long, but generally speaking, like rule of thumb, like keep it tight, I think, to help.
I agree.
Yeah, I completely agree. When I'm scrolling through Stitcher or Spotify, if I'm like getting on a bus or a train, I tend to know, I have 40 minutes of commuting time, and I have my podcast that I'm obsessed with that like go, into the 70, 80, 90 minutes category where it's like at that point you're basically watching a movie. But I feel like unless you are like rabidly obsessed with it and it has this cult following, I think people, might be like, oh, do I have 80 minutes, 90 minutes to sit here and listen to a podcast? Unless you're driving to Florida or something.
Well, then it's like having a book on tape, which I used to do on long road trips. But those true crime episodes are pretty tight, are pretty long too, I think. Yeah. But, someone here, Chrissy, said, listen, this is where I'm stuck, researching, deciding how to script this. And one of the things I'll say is you can figure this out by starting. There's no reason you have to. We're going to adjust the Stuff Mom Never Told You format. We want to include more audience interaction and engaging with our audience's mail in the future. Like there are lots of different featurettes that we want to start to integrate, but starting, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, y'all. Get your voice out there, get started, and then adjust, react, iterate. That cycle of creative iteration is just so important to get started, get your voice out there, because you can figure it out as you go and respond to what works. You can see what works. You can see what your audience reacts to most, and then you can take it from there.
Yeah, I just want to lift up everything Emilie's saying. Totally agree. I have a phrase that I heard that I love, sort of build the plane while landing it. You can get started and jump in and make changes and adapt and be nimble based on what works. So one of my favorite podcasts, and actually one of the oldest podcasts out there, is called Yeah Dude, and they started in 2006, like early days of the medium. And I've been listening for 10 years now, and the way that the podcast was formatted in the beginning is so different to how it is now. And so they used to have all these different little segments, and they would play little audio clips and do all these different kinds of things. The way the show is now is so different than those early 2006, 2007 iterations of the show. So really, it's about trying things out, responding to your audience, seeing what works, seeing what feels good for you as a host and as a producer, and making kind of intentional choices based on that.
Yeah, and it's not wrong to make a change because it's what you want. That's what being a creative is about. You have to go with your gut. You have to do what works for you. And sometimes if you adapt too much based on what you think will work for your audience, if it's not working for you, you're going to hear that. The other thing that's so important that we've had a few questions come in on is, I've got a podcast, or I started my podcast, but nobody's listening to it. Like, how do I build my audience? And it's kind of like being an entrepreneur, because you have to give people a reason to keep in touch with you. So I think that social media cross promotion, meaning featuring other podcasters on your podcast and asking for that reciprocal kind of give back in the same way, that's a big part of this, making sure that people who are already listening go to where that audience is and put yourself in front of them. So whether it's growing organically on social media, or maybe creating an email list, like going to a website where you can subscribe to get updates, there are ways to build an audience, most of which happen off of Apple Podcast, off of Spotify, off of the RSS feed. You build your audience just the same way that you build a business, really, is cultivating an audience and capturing their attention so that you can continue to serve them your great episodes in their inbox or in their social media feeds. Bridget, you're a social media queen. Do you have any advice on how to get started for someone who is sort of overwhelmed by all of the different things we should be doing in social media?
Yeah, I would say, that's a great insight, that it's so easy to get overwhelmed. It's so easy to think, there are 8,000 social media platforms. Do I need to be on all of them? I would say, in order to preserve your sanity and your capacity, really focus on where your audience is. And so our audience is, they love commenting on Instagram, they love commenting on Facebook, they love commenting on Twitter. And so really, I made some intentional choices about prioritizing those platforms, as opposed to expanding on platforms where maybe they aren't showing us the same amount of love. So I would say, recognizing that you, as one person, unless you have like a social media team, you probably can't do them all. So really prioritizing where folks are having those conversations and be willing to hang out there. Something else that I have found has been a little bit sort of a new thing is that people really, as we were saying before, podcasting is such a, intimate medium. People want to feel like you're accessible, that they can talk to you, that if they have a follow-up question or they just want to know where you got your new glasses, hint, 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 they can see a picture on Instagram and ask you. And so really being accessible, responding to comments, all of that, and just sort of showing them that you're a real person, not just a voice in your ear, I think has been great. So just really get out there, feel it out, wait around, make mistakes, all of that.
That's such good advice. And I also want to say that if you don't have a built-in audience, you can still build one. It takes time. I think there's these crazy gimmicky programs online now that's like how to grow your Instagram following by 110%. Just pay me $50 and I'll tell you how. I would be wary of those. I started Bossed Up back in 2013 with less than 500 of my personal contacts that I begged, borrowed, and stealed to subscribe to our newsletter. And since then, we've seen more than 10%, not 10%, but more than a factor of 10 growth. We've seen more like growth by a factor of 20 because it compounds over time. If you consistently provide value to people, they're going to tell other people about you. That's it. If you consistently give people a reason to subscribe or to stay on your feed because you're giving them things, creative creations that do make their lives better, that to me is like the trick to organic growth. And it's not a trick. It's an exchange of their attention for your promise to deliver value with their attention.
Totally. Just to add to that, and I see one of the questions of how do we know how often and how much to post or how much to spend on social media? So I would say that's really about your audience. And so in my day jobs, I have managed various social media accounts, MSNBC, Planned Parenthood, other big accounts, and really it's about your audience. And so maybe your audience loves a post an hour. Maybe a post an hour is way too much and you're annoying them because they're always in their feed. It's really about looking at the analytics and being able to say, okay, I went to my Facebook Insights tab and I see that when I posted once every 2 hours, people engaged with it this way, and then make a decision based on that. And so everyone's audience is going to be different. The Stuff Mom Never Told You audience is probably different than Two Dope Queens' audience. And so we have to be making our social media decisions and basing like how often we spend on it and all of that on our audiences. And so really it's about, checking in with them, looking at Facebook Insights and Twitter analytics on the back end, and really making choices based on that. But honestly, it really comes back to what Emilie said about just putting out compelling content. And so folks often ask me in terms of social media, how do you get a following, all of that? Never, never, ever. Like when she was talking about buying followers, that's such a terrible idea. Never do that. There was just a recent thing where some like rappers on Instagram had, Instagram cracked down on fake followers, and all these rappers overnight, they went from having millions and millions of followers to just a few thousands because they bought fake followers. And so that doesn't actually help you. If you overnight got 1 million followers on your podcast's Facebook page, but those followers are fake and they're not engaging with your stuff, liking your stuff, sharing your stuff, commenting on your stuff, Facebook, it's not going to help you at all, right? So it's better to have a small amount of authentic followers who are engaging with the compelling content that you're consistently putting out than to have 1 million followers.
That's a great point. And this is the kind of deeper dive stuff that we're going to talk more about at Work It. So if you want an even deeper workshop on this, I can see based on the comments that we have lots more questions on this, but I do want to make sure that we preserve some time at the end for that. And I also think it all boils down to not being afraid to promote yourself. Aisha asked a really great question here I want to lift up, which is if you are on this webinar and you have your own podcast, do us a favor. Tell us about it in the comments right now in the chat room. Tell us what your podcast is called, what it's about, and why we should listen. Because being able to make that kind of a pitch succinctly, as when you can, is also about knowing that you're worth promoting yourself, which is kind of a radical thing in today's world still, because women who promote themselves are not always seen as like the most likable, but we push back on that, and I think we all should. So I'd encourage you to do that. One final thing we have to talk about is money in podcasting. And I know that Paula and I were wrestling with this part of the presentation because we do not want to give y'all the impression that you should start a podcast for the money. That would be a false promise on our end. The money is there. The industry is growing, but it is not a quick return on investment. And oftentimes, if you were to calculate your hourly rate based on your advertising revenue, you're not going to like what you see. So, know that having an audience means you can develop a rate card, which says, here's the amount of audience you're going to get. Here's what you should pay for a 30-second or a 60-second, host read ad that I'm going to record and put out on my next episode for you. And you can develop that math, Google that. We can talk more about that at Work It. But know that it's not easy. Paula, did you want to add to that?
Just like here. It's definitely, it would be irresponsible if I said you could make a lot of money in podcasting overnight. I think start doing it because you have something original to say, and work on growing an audience. In some ways there's potentially more returns in the long run with a very loyal audience than a giant audience of people who barely listen to the whole thing. I think if you keep at it, you could be a Megan Tan and get picked up by a network. You could be a Mark Maron and still be independent after all these years and doing quite well for yourself. Or more likely, something in between. It does take a lot of downloads to start being able to monetize. There are also a lot of networks that, on the other side, there are a lot of places that really want to sell ads for podcasters. And I think there's a company called Oxford Road that does, that does ad sales, and Acast. And there are places where if you have a small but growing audience, they will sell ads for you. And that doesn't, and it'll be an interesting experience to see whether you like it. I actually want to recommend a podcast to listen to called, there's a podcast called Call Your Girlfriend, which is fantastic. And it's co-hosted by Amina Sao and Ann Friedman, and produced by a woman named Gina Delvac, all of whom are also going to be at Work It. But they had an incredible episode that everyone on this webinar should listen to. It was about the origin story of Call Your Girlfriend, because that's another podcast that started, I'm trying to look up what the episode name was. It started, and it's still independent. And they started it on their own, and they have a great episode about their, I think it's called Businesswoman Special. That's what it is. Episode 88, going behind the scenes into the making of the podcast. And they, they started to grow a little bit. They tell the story, they started to grow a little bit. They were like, maybe we should, they didn't go into it for the money, but they were like, hey, maybe we could sell some ads. And they've gone through a couple different people selling ads for them until they settled on one that they feel really gets them. And I will also say that, we're trying to move into a more diversified revenue model. I think, right now, a lot of it is, it's mostly impression-based ads. But, I listened to the producer of WTF with Mark Maron saying how when they first started, merchandise was a really big part of their revenue stream. And now it's not so much, they don't need it as much, but that really helped. We worked on a podcast called The Longest Shortest Time, right, which is a parenting podcast. And she started it on her own through a Kickstarter. And we ended up picking her up, and then she's now with Midroll and totally, makes a living out of that. So those things like Kickstarter and Patreon are increasingly being used, even just to get a little bit of money to get off the ground can be really helpful too. But, it requires a lot of work.
Definitely. I also want to, reinforce what you said about that episode of Call Your Girlfriend, because they really are very transparent with the kind of wrestle and the mistakes that they made along the way about the money involved in podcasting. And I love that episode because they talk frankly about buying the licensing rights to Robin's song, Call Your Girlfriend, and these kind of upfront, scary business parts of podcasting that you have to consider, because this is not just a creative endeavor, it's also a business endeavor. So bringing both parts of your brain to the table in that way, and just underscoring what Paula said, knowing that you don't have to do all of it. You can actually enlist the help of someone to sell ads for you. You're going to give them a cut of that. You're going to pay them for their efforts, but know that you don't have to be every part of your podcast umbrella. Even if you are an independent, this can be a collective endeavor. The other thing that I've seen people successfully convert their listeners to in terms of cash, besides ads, besides revenue based on merch, is courses. A lot of the entrepreneurs who shouted out here said that they were coaches or consultants. You can do an episode about negotiation and then convert them to your negotiation course. You know, you can give a big chunk of information and then give even more information in a packaged way that you can sell on your website. So just keep in mind that something we do at Bossed Up a lot is how can you give people value for free and then give them even more for a small fee or for a large fee, because there's nothing wrong with making money either. We just don't want to give you the impression that, and there's nothing wrong with wanting to make a boatload of money. We just don't want to give you that false impression that podcast is going to make it rain for you overnight. B, did you add any? I saw you wanted to jump in.
Well, when you were talking about sort of the not forgetting that podcasting is a business, I'm someone who is completely creative brained, right? Like when I think of podcasting, I just want to tell a beautiful story and then hear other beautiful stories told back to me. So I'm very lucky to work with a co-host like Emilie, who is a lot better at the sort of business end of it. If allowed, I would just be, you know, it would be totally creative for me. And it's good to have a guy, like if you can get a co-host where you balance each other out on that in that way, the way that I think Emilie and I do, it can be really helpful.
Right back at ya. I love it. All right. So we know that we've got tons of questions. We want to get to them, but before we do, we want to make sure you know that you are all cordially invited to Work It, the one of its kind women's podcasting festival that WNYC is hosting, that we are so excited to be speaking at, Bridget and I. It's in Los Angeles. It's coming up October 3 through 5. And that's where we're going to have even more time to dive deep into workshops that will help you launch or grow your podcast. And you're going to have the opportunity to sit in on live recordings with two dope queens. You're going to meet the people behind some of your favorite podcasts, and sort of really, I think part of what I'm most excited about is just connecting with women in this space and diverse voices from across the world in this space who you can get inspired by. Paula, do you want to tell us a little bit more about what's in store at Work It?
Yeah, like you said, we started about 3 years ago. It's now going to LA, and it's workitfestival.com. And we have the Call Your Girlfriend women will be there. The Two Dope Queens women will be there. God, I got to look at my list. People from, if anybody ever heard Making Oprah out of WBEZ with host Jen White, she's going to be there. The Welcome to Night Vale people will be there. Another Round women will be there. Tracy and Heaven. People from Gimlet, from Startup, Lisa Chow. Nigel Poor, who just launched an amazing podcast called Ear Hustle that's recorded inside San Quentin. Amber Hunt, who did the Accused true crime podcast. Nora McInerney from Terrible Thanks for Asking. Emilie and Bridget, and Molly Webster from Radiolab. Manoush Marodi is going to be there. Anna Sale, host of Just Sex and Money. I just like it. It's an incredible lineup. So check it out. And we also, it's 3 days, and the first day is a boot camp. So it's really great for people who are just getting into it. A lot of hands-on workshops. And the second 2 days are continuing conversations around the medium, being a woman in the medium, and there's a lot of networking opportunities, and people come out of it and they say, like, it's really a profound transformative experience just to be in a room with all those women with the same shared goals. So I encourage you guys to check it out and join us.
I love it. I love it. I'm so excited. I hope you'll head over to workitfestival.com right now to learn everything more that there is to learn about it and get your ticket now. There's lots of different options for tickets. So we hope to see you there. Quick clarifying question that came up in chat before we move on to our formal Q&A part of today. Is there going to be a web option to join the conference virtually, or is this something that's really in person?
It's really in person. There might be parts of it that are live streamed. It kind of depends. We've done live streams in the past, but we haven't quite decided whether we're going to do it this year. It kind of changes the tenor a little bit. We might, but I can't promise it.
I think that's perfectly valid. I'm a big fan of the in-person experience too. So get your butt to LA. I know it's a big investment, but Work It Festival is going to make that investment worth your while, and it's going to, in many ways, be an accelerator for what you're looking for out of podcasting. And what that really could be, to just tie it back to the theme of today, is the next phase of your career. So know that this is still a growing industry. There's a lot more room to grow when it comes to only 30 some odd percent of American audience members tuning into podcasts. There's so much more market there to develop. And we want women's voices to be a part of that. So that's what Work It is all about. And I hope that we can see you there. And at this time, I would encourage you to ask any and all questions you have for us. We'll take a few more minutes. I know we're a little beyond time, but we'll take, if you have it, Paula and Bridget, maybe 5 minutes of Q&A. So one question that came up from, I want to say Hadia said, thank you for talking up storytelling. It is a craft. Are there any books or any podcasts that you know in the works on how to tell a story? Or is it simply a painful trial and error experience that every podcaster has to go through themselves to figure it out? Anyone want to take this one? Because I know this is something we wrestled with in preparing this presentation.
Yeah, this is a great question, and I'm so glad you lifted it. I'm sure Paula will have a lot more resources, but I know for me, it's really been a trial and error thing. Learning from other podcasts, listening to my favorite podcasts and determining, they did this thing that I liked, or they formatted this thing in this way, and really borrowing a lot from what they're doing has been really helpful. So definitely don't be afraid to borrow from people you think are doing it right, and try things out to see if they work for your style.
I think that's such a good point. There's a book exactly on that called Steal Like an Artist. It's a small book. It's very creative, and I love it because it reminded me that it's okay to be inspired by other people and make it your own. Only you can produce the kind of art that you are going to produce, but it doesn't mean you can't be inspired by other people. And of course, we want to give credit where credit is due. We don't want to be, we're not talking about copyright infringement here.
No,
but we are
talking break the law.
Right, but we are talking about, like, go shopping for your favorite podcast, create what you love and see in the world, and bring resources together, bring inspiration together to make it your own.
There's actually another podcast I would recommend called How Sound, and it's about How Sound, and it comes out of the Transom Storytelling Workshop, which is like a 6-week course you can take to learn the basics. But How Sound, basically every week or so, it's a different lesson in audio storytelling, which is a good one.
I would also, sorry.
Go ahead, Bridget.
I would also just lift up the idea that when it comes to storytelling, don't necessarily just think of it as keeping it limited to podcast storytelling. I know that one of the things that was really beneficial for Emilie and our podcast was looking at what they call public narrative storytelling trainings, which comes from a political organizing and grassroots community organizing background. And they certainly weren't talking about telling stories on podcasts. It was about using stories to move people on social issues. But that framing of, challenges and choices and beginning, middle, and end has been really helpful in our podcast storytelling as well.
Awesome. I think that's such a good point. There's one more organization in DC. I've been trying to Google its name here, but failing. I believe it's called DC StoryCorps, or I'm thinking about NPR's StoryCorps, but DC something story, where you can get on stage and practice telling your story, which is of course terrifying for most people, but it comes with a workshop beforehand. And I would also recommend looking into any and all public speaking training that's out there for you to develop your voice and develop the ways in which you can pull together a story. We have a great question here from Kayastha, which I think is an awesome name, who asks, she's a big time listener of Stuff Mom Never Told You. She says, it's amazing how well researched each of your episodes are. Thank you. I would also underscore that we have made mistakes and we will make mistakes, and our wonderful listeners are rarely shy in pointing out those mistakes, but that's how we learn and grow together. But her question is one of the things that we're going to talk through at Work It, because Work It actually has some of the podcast hosts that are going, like Bridget and I, have sessions all about how it's made. So exactly what our format is for how we prepare, which I think is such a great way to pull back the curtain and share what goes into each podcast episode. But to briefly preview that session, she says, how much time do you spend approximately to prepare for each episode? Do you also record on the topics that you aren't well versed on, which takes longer to research and all? Bridget, what would you say to that?
Oh, I think you know where I'm going with this. So I think I would say just as a technical thing, I think it's been a few hours per episode. I think it's about maybe 4.5 hours, 5 hours of back end research before we even get to the studio. We've definitely talked about topics that we're not well versed on. A big example is that I am not at all a sports person. I'm someone who thinks that you get a touchdown in baseball. And we did an episode around hockey, and it took a lot of research to pull together, and we got it completely wrong. We said the wrong name of the team, and people were really eager to point this mistake out to us, and it was a complete mistake, and we had to own it. And so I want to also encourage you to embrace topics that you might not be experts on. I don't know that I'll talk about hockey again, but I want to talk about topics that I'm not an expert on, just because that's how I learn. So,
right.
What do you think?
I think that's a great example. I'll defend us a little bit in saying we got the National Women's Hockey League mixed up with the U.S. National Women's Hockey Team, which share 3 out of 5 words in common. So just to go to the mat once more in defense of a mistake, we got eaten alive by hockey fans, which we'll never mess with again. But I would say that we have the luxury, Bridget and I, of being on a network, a great network, How Stuff Works, that pays us for all of that time and energy and effort. If I were an independent podcaster, I wouldn't have the luxury of having 4.5 hours to prepare for every podcast episode, much less to put 2 out a week. Okay, that's a job we're talking about here. So from an independent perspective, I spend a lot of my time researching, writing, thinking about, and creating training programs around burnout, sustainability, negotiation, assertive communication, all the topics that we cover at Bossed Up. If I were to produce a Bossed Up podcast totally on my own, I would be talking exclusively almost about the things I already know a lot about. And maybe, of course, you got to grow and research and fill in the blanks and cover new topics as they come out. But to me, that's the price we pay for being thought leaders, is keeping up with thoughts, right? Reading, writing, and being a part of a conversation is a two-way street. We definitely take on historical topics that we don't know about. We just cut an episode last week that'll come out in a few weeks, actually later this month, on Women's Equality Day, which is an awesome holiday that I thought I knew about, but we did not know the cool, amazing story behind it. So doing historical episodes like that means there's no gray area. There's right and there's wrong. And if we got something wrong, I'm sure we're going to hear about it, but we give it our best and we don't pretend to be perfect. So I love being a vehicle for repackaging information that inspires, that helps other people move their journey along. Bridget, can you talk about the ADHD episode? Because I think that's such a good example of taking a topic that we thought we knew a little bit about, diving deeper into it, and the impact it's had on some of our listeners.
Yeah, I mean, if anyone listened to that episode, it's a little bit about me talking about my personal journey with ADHD and then diving into the research. Before I started researching that episode, I really thought I understood this issue. Like, I thought I was not going to learn anything about this issue. I thought I knew it pretty intimately from dealing with it myself. But really, that research showed me that on any given topic, even if it's a topic that you've experienced personally or that you think that you're an expert on, there's always an avenue that you didn't know about. So I learned a lot from that episode, things that went against things that I thought I knew, examples of things that really kind of highlighted or opened a door on this issue that I thought I knew, frontward and backward. And I think the impact for our audience has been amazing. Listing things like symptoms to watch out for, or people telling stories of experiences they've had with the disorder. People have, it's almost like we, through that research, have given people the power to sort of make diagnosis themselves and say, oh, like that sounds like me. I got to get to a doctor. Or I got to talk to a mental health professional. And so really, this research can change lives, can impact the trajectory of people's entire worlds. And so really, we take it just so seriously. And I think that episode was a great example of how serious it is.
That's a great point. We've got one more question that I want to ask Paula and you about, Bridget. Chrissy N asked, and maybe Paula, think about some of the podcasts that you're part of producing and how these shows navigate this. Chrissy asks, being that podcasting is an audio medium, how can we translate that to images for social media that research suggests will get better results? Now, I think that last part is tricky because you have to remember what Bridget said about analytics and how every audience is different. But how do you take an audio product, in this case, a free podcast, and turn it into an online presence that includes the visual and includes text? Like, how do you actually do that for the shows that you work on at WNYC Studios?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge challenge. That's a really, really good question. Visuals do well on social and audio is not visual. So it's something that we grapple with every day. And we actually created a tool that is open sourced. If you know someone who can help you with it, called an audiogram, where you can clip pieces of audio and put them on basically a JPEG. But we spend a lot of time being really nimble and creative about just using our iPhones to shoot hosts in the studio, to take pictures of everybody at work. I mean, I think people are really interested in seeing and looking behind the scenes. We are also a big organization, but at the same time, we don't have giant video and photography resources. And so, but we do what we can. And if you look at our feeds, we post regularly. We also focus on basically the brand personality. So whether that's highlighting things like reacting to what's going on in the news, responding to the fans who write to us, sharing the things that we're kind of obsessed with. We a lot of hosts will post stuff about what they're reading and what they're watching, and we've over the past few years gotten a lot more rigorous about every time wherever we're recording, making sure to get some images while we're at it. So it's not a problem that's going to go away. I think you have to be really creative about it, and keep also tabs on the Facebook algorithms and how they're changing.
I think that's such a good point. And Bridget and I are just figuring this out in real time, because the personal part of the personal brand is kind of a funny thing, because there's this, at least for me, I don't know about you, Bridget, but I am a little reticent to be a selfie queen. You know what I mean? Like, and in reality, your audience wants to see you. That's who they're listening to. They want to know what you're doing. And so it's been a weird thing to get more comfortable just putting your face out there, telling people about your day. But that's what the personality driven podcasts are thriving on socially, I think. But Bridget, what do you think?
I completely agree. I think that this was something I struggled with early on. And then, I think we posted something on Instagram and someone was like, oh, so that's what it looks like. That's what you guys look like. And I think since it's such an intimate medium, it is important for people to be able to put that face to a voice that's in their ear every night.
I think they said also, you don't look like what I thought your voices would look like, which you're like, I don't know how to feel about that. So again, being a podcaster can be really vulnerable. You can get called out for getting things wrong. You can get called out for having unpopular opinions. If you'd like to hear one of my very unpopular opinions, tune in to today's new episode of Stuff Mom Never Told You for more. But just keep in mind that, there's something powerful about connecting with individuals that happens through mediums like podcasting and like social media. It can change the course of our listeners' lives, like Bridget underscored earlier. But you also have to protect your own damn boundaries. You have to be comfortable with not being overexposed. You have to be comfortable in that vulnerability, or at least not overstretch yourself in that growth process of becoming more comfortable. I don't think anyone was born naturally comfortable on like a selfie shot video, like on our Insta story at Bossed Up today. But it's something that can become more, you can become more comfortable with through practice, and keep in mind what your goal is. Like, who's your audience and what's your goal for them? And you're not doing it for your own fame necessarily. You're doing it for the change you want to make in other people's lives. So that's what keeps me fired up and ready to go about this. Any last words, Paula, Bridget, before we close?
No, I really want to thank everybody. It's been really amazing and interesting to look at how far and wide people have tuned in from, and the really, really good questions. And it's very inspiring. So thank you. Thanks for having me, Emilie. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Paula.
Yeah, my only last comment is get out there and use your voice. Make mistakes, try it out. We need more women out there, so do it.
Yeah, get in the ring, y'all. We will be in your inbox soon with or get in the studio, I should say. We'll be in your inboxes soon with an email from me with a link to watch the recording to today's what is today? Today's webinar. Feel free to share that far and wide. And Paula might be in your inbox soon, and WNYC Studios might be in your inbox soon, to encourage you to take the leap to join Bridget and I and Paula at Work It in Los Angeles this fall. We cannot wait to meet with y'all in person, as well as
please introduce yourself to us.
Yeah, please do if you see us wandering the halls there. And I'm sure that each and every one of you on today's webinar knows some woman who has a voice to share with the world, who needs that voice to be heard. Please encourage her to, at the very least, watch this webinar, but even more so, bring her with you to the Work It Festival, because you can be the difference between someone who feels like they're worthy and someone who feels encouraged to make her voice heard. So let's go on and lift as we climb, as we like to say at Bossed Up. And I can't wait to talk to y'all soon in your earbuds, in your screens, or in person at Work It. Thanks, everybody. Talk to you later.